Sveiki visi. Tęsime mūsų ciklą Materija kaip kūrybinis instrumentas architektūroje. Šiandien turėsim 4. paskaitą anglų kalba. Kaip parinkti medžiagas architektūros labui. Dabar aš perinu į anglų kalbą. So I'm glad to welcome today an outstanding architect Sami Rintala, who works inspires me for years. And Sami Juhani Rintala finished his architectural studies at the Helsinki University of Technology. Alongside, he studied in Denmark, Aarhus Architektūroje, Finland, Iceland. It's amazing that he started work in the field as a construction worker in his youth. Later, he became a teacher at high school, at universities, worked at architect office Casa Grande and Rintala. And since 2007, he, together with Dagur Egertsson, established their office at Rintala Egertsson Architects. And later, 1 year later, Vibeke Jensen has joined them. Actually, they all three together are not just partners, they also are students of famous phenomenological architect Juhani Palasma. And in a way, this shows the approach they take into the design. Actually, it is not only architectural grounded, but a very broad cross-disciplinary approach. And they managed to develop projects around the world, starting from Finland, Norway, but also in Italy, Japan, South Korea, Iceland, Switzerland, etc. And their works were exhibited at the Maxim Museum in Rome, Victoria and Albert Museum in London, the National Art Museum of China, and in 2018 they took part in Venice Biennale. Actually, I could talk endlessly about their projects, but I'm very keen to hear today Sami talking about how to choose materials for the benefit of architecture. Of course, he's broadening this question and asking how to choose material for the human well-being or how to combine them for the benefit of the nature. So I'm stopping here and just passing the word to Sam. So Sami, you may share your screen.
So yeah, I hope you can both hear me and see my screen. Yeah.
Yes, yes.
Good. Yeah, it's very nice to be invited even through internet to Lithuania and Vilnius. I was there last time, 1998 or 97 or something like that, traveling through, photographing things and having a look at the old town and eating very well. I remember meeting nice people and so on. So I am sure we will come back one day to continue from there. Yeah, I'm going to talk for a while now, and I already warned a little bit. It's a bit messy lecture because I got kind of sidetracked by the question that was Ida was asking me to prepare. So now you will see plenty of sidetracking. But our office is called Rintala Egertsson Architects for sure, and we come from the white areas, Helsinki and Reykjavik, the lines there. And then we live in Oslo and Bodø and have offices in those two towns. I'm living far north here with my office, and Dagur Eggertsson from Reykjavik, he's living downtown in Oslo with his office, but we share the name and values and cooperate very closely with these two small offices. So we are not a big team at all. Now let's see how I continue my presentation. Yeah, there we go. So yeah, just to show you a little bit how things look like here. If you haven't been to North Norway, Bodø is in the 67th north degree, and this is the view from my home more or less 1 week ago in the morning sun. So it's a kind of a mountainous area and very Arctic, but still it's the bigger city over there. And just have to mention architects shouldn't be interested of anything else than architecture, but I'm interested in football and culture in general. And we have a really good team that beat AS Roma 6-1 some time ago. And also we are becoming the European capital of culture in 2024. So it's a kind of funny city where things are happening at the moment in the outskirts. So it's nice to be here. So the question for me was how to choose materials for the benefit of architecture. And it kind of raised the other questions in my mind. It was a kind of starting question for me. And the questions were, for instance, how to choose rather architecture for the benefit of materials, because I feel architecture is our tool, what we use, and materials are somehow, we can't choose them sometimes. It's a bit too easy to say that we can just go and choose materials. I think we first have to choose other things. The next question, how to choose materials for the benefit of people, could also be interesting, because we don't want to benefit our tool, architecture. We want to benefit people and even nature. The next question, how to choose materials for the benefit of nature, of course, is very, very much talked about these days with the Glasgow meeting and all. But then I kind of used a mathematical equation to put them all together, and thinking that what we really can choose is our architecture. And that's being our work method. And that should be in benefit of all these things, materials, people and nature. So whatever it means, it's a complex question. And maybe that's why architecture is so interesting thing to do, because it is so complex. And what I'm going to do now is that based on this kind of amateur mathematics, I will discuss these things a little bit. The thing about material and choosing materials is just, I can't help it. Kind of sounds a bit materialistic way of looking at things. And materialism, of course, is somehow considered a quite negative thing in architecture, because it is something against intellectual or spiritual thinking sometimes seen. So it might also have this association. So when you are looking at catalogs and choosing your materials for the benefit of whatever people or architecture, so it can become a bit too direct way of working. This, of course, is a kind of far-fetched image, but I just found it before the lecture. I thought this is materialism and choosing materials also. But it's a very Western way of thinking, I feel. And in some other cultures, like in some Eastern philosophies, emptiness or absence of other things is not really a negative state of affairs, or the absence of material in this example, but it is rather a kind of state of stillness and a mirror of the universe. So in other words, it's a possibility for everything. And I feel that in architecture, we try to have the possibility for everything, the space, the emptiness, where everything is possible and we don't decide what is happening there rather than select what's going to happen there. So if we look at two first words that I was using, the architecture and materials, I feel they are the two things in that list, the others being people and nature. Architecture and materials are not alive per se, they are dead, and we organize them into architecture or whatever. So it's nice to look at them first. So I'm kind of trying to describe to myself more than anyone else what I'm doing here with the question. So here we are doing some material into architecture in one workshop. And architecture, if you have a human-centered or kind of classical or cultural view of it, it is has a very strong symbolic value and artistic value. And it's a kind of measure of civilization level at a given time. So we tend to look at history books and see how different civilizations were able to build certain things and what they were expressing with that. In this way of seeing, architecture is an imitation of nature, a shelter against the elements, or even the shelter against the nature. I think nowadays, currently, we are, for a long time already, we have seen that architecture can be seen differently as well. It can be seen as a part of a biocultural evolution of human being. And in this way, seeing our biocultural architecture is part of nature as well. It's not an imitation of it, but it's part of it. And in this sense, we are perhaps able to make ecological architecture as well, is my feeling, that if we start feeling and thinking of architecture rather part of nature than imitation of it, it could be closer to the truth as well. Then there's a lot of things have been said about architecture for sure, and we all are aware of it. And one statement is form follows function from the functionalist era, but later on some brain neural researchers actually have stated the opposite, that in living creatures functions follows the form. And this is not a materialistic way of looking at the world. It is rather result of watching how life is organizing itself, and it organizes itself for sure in form, and then matter comes later. This is very interesting. And then architecture has this dualistic quality that I'm very interested of. And if I simplify architecture, sometimes I do it often this way, that I feel strongly that there's an exterior and interior quality, and they kind of are pretty separate from each other, although functionalism previously said exactly believe the opposite, that the plan is the generator and it kind of creates the exterior as well from inside out, perhaps. But I feel that these are two different things. And when you have an exterior of a building, it is a form and a symbol in a landscape, a kind of personality, or even an animal or a creature that is doing something. They're watching some direction, turning its back to another, and so on. So having these kind of physical qualities and personality. while the interior is a kind of more universal thing. It doesn't comment the surroundings so much other than as almost two-dimensional pictures of its framings. And these two things, how they are read differently, is there are some very interesting descriptions of this. And one of them is in the book Tor Heyerdahl wrote about his travel with Kon-Tiki. You must have heard about this Norwegian thing that happened, and he's describing the floating barge they were using for this crossing of the Pacific Sea. When he went swimming one day to the sea, he was describing the floating object as a very tiny and fragile thing in the middle of the ocean, as a form in that landscape, and thinking that we will never make it to the other side, that this can't work. But then he went in on the barge, and inside the small room they have made of some really thin grass or similar vegetation. And he said that when he looked at the Pacific Ocean through that only opening, the door opening, he felt totally safe and kind of transported to his home. So he wasn't in the middle of the Pacific Ocean, but he was in a space, in an interior that made him feel sheltered, no matter how false that feeling was. So I feel that these two forces from inside and outside are kind of interesting to look at when you decide on your design as well. And then to complicate the matters, or maybe related to what I said earlier, I think there's a new kind of complexity to architecture that is not so man-made complexity, but more about understanding the things around the man-made rules. And these kind of new or future essentials are very interesting to incorporate to our designs. And again, all these statements, and we know, of course, that the truth is somewhere in between these things, but it's interesting to see how language and architecture are related to each other in these three examples, for instance, and how also our means of production have changed along these three steps as well. So you might ask, what is the next slogan and the next architecture, of course. But for us, we have thought about these ideas of exterior form in landscape and the interior, but it's also connected to tradition and on the other hand, the advancement of technology and how to incorporate that to our designs. So we are kind of bound in time as well, not just place. And you could say that even if you can recognize the visible aspects of the site and the culture, or on larger manner the biological context, which includes nature as well, you still have the historic and civilizational component there. You could call it the social anthropological context or philosophical context, and that again makes the making of architecture even more interesting, if possible. And I made this kind of small, very simple diagram for myself when making this lecture now, thinking that the visual aspects of our design is actually a really small part of what we are working with. It is something, yeah, if you look at this axis, there is on the linear axis from left to right, there's the timeline. And then on the vertical axis, there is the idea of a person, of what's happening in our head. and then what's happening in a higher level of many people, like often architecture incorporates lots of people, and then under the horizon is the subconscious level where dreams and ideas are merging in an unexplainable manner, but surely very important area for creativity. And if we look at what is the evidence of architecture, it is something that has happened in the past behind us and with the societal level from one person to society. And that is what we can see, and that is what we can kind of evaluate in architecture, and also copy if you want to think and learn from, for sure. But then there's the future, and our design, of course, always should be about the future, because it's something that will be built for people in ahead of us, after us. And we have to imagine that. So it goes necessarily to the subconscious world. It is imaginary. And even in the past, we can only imagine what people thought when they were designing these buildings, or even when they lived in them and used them, and that also is imaginary. So my statement, funny statement maybe, would be that 3/4 of our design and imagining of architecture is happening in a kind of gray area where there's no evidence of things. So we have to kind of master these areas as well, not just looking at what's been done and what are the materials, for instance, and so on, how to choose them from a catalog. It has to be beyond that. About materials, I want to even make a stronger statement. I think we are having a problem with that, because if your raw materials are unknown, you don't know where they come from, you don't know who harvested them from nature, and you don't know how good they are, their value is unknown as well. You could make a reference to making food, that it's a kind of non-site specific architecture or cooking. It has no nutrition or meaning somehow, that your materials are not working with you towards a good quality. While if you know where your raw materials come from and who took them up and what is their nutritional value, this is much better chain of material for architecture as well, and for food for sure. So some examples. Yeah. And the other components were the living components, people and nature. And of course, there's so many different places on the planet around objects where people and nature are in different proportions. And this is one diagram showing the purple amount of people on different latitudes, and then amount of land in those latitudes. And if I just randomly put a arrow somewhere in Nordic countries, we see that there's almost most land in this latitude, and then almost no people living here. So of course, when we are making a project in India, then it's the opposite almost. So we have to think differently about people and nature, their relationship. Not that people aren't part of it. And also, people have different values, their own value systems, imagined systems, like money, and also the amount how people live in cities is different. But this diagram here might look a bit complex in the beginning, but if you again read it like the previous one, and you see also growth from the 60s to 80s to 2005, you will see how population, urban population density, and also income has grown or not grown in different areas of the world. And again, you see, if you compare Scandinavia, you see there's a lot of income in general in north and south, and then less income in the middle. the latitudes, while the population is growing really quickly on the middle part. So again, there's a very big contrast here going on. And even though we are few people in the cold areas, at least some animals are choosing exactly the opposite way of occupying those areas. They want to stay close because it's so cold. So it's a kind of paradox. Even with low density, maybe architecture should also, again, football here, would mean that we need to cling together. So this is our own problem. Of course, it's not a universal problem, but these are some more traditionally built cities in far north. So the kind of functionalist idea of spreading evenly everywhere, like has happened, then maybe it's not the best way to live. Another example from the Aleutian Islands in Canada, very interesting native way of building density, even in a very difficult spot. So if you again look at people and nature, or culture and nature, the difference of our system, man-made system, is that our mental images are often things that don't really exist. So we are communicating with ideas and systems and hierarchies that are imagined. And that kind of is the glue in our societies between people, let's say like money or time. And while in nature this is kind of not important, it is rather, nature is based on collage or flux of things that connect and use what is available and existing. And again, if I go back in a couple of slides, I was talking about the idea of architecture being part of nature, not the imitation of it. I think the idea, the red text saying what is available, existing, and connecting and using it would be, I think, a very much better way of making architecture than basing it on the ideas that don't really exist. And this, of course, is about the idea of materialism as well, like it being maybe something that we are building things that we really don't need, while we are creating needs that create different kind of buildings. The nature, of course, like human nature in this sense, is a really old phenomena. So it has created human beings as hunters and gatherers mainly, but only very short time has we have been doing agriculture and stayed in one place, creating cities and changing our lives totally. So you could state that our real selves is not based on agriculture and urbanism. It's just a later adjustment based on other things than what nature made us for. In this later development, we have expressed ourselves in very many different ways via architecture. And you could, to make it easier to understand architecture as an expression, you could compare it to languages or even dialects. So in certain areas you have certain languages. We all know that I'm speaking a language that I really don't speak normally when I was born in Finland, and you also come from a smaller language area, so you know what I'm talking about. And today there are about 6,000 languages, and 5,000 of them on the planet has less than 100,000 speakers. In 100 years ago, they estimate there was 10 times more languages on the planet, like 60,000 languages. And they also estimate that in 100 years ahead, if things are still going like they do, there will be around 1,000 languages left, and most of them small languages. So there's an estimation of average every 2 weeks dies a person who is the last representative of his or her own culture or civilization or language. And they go with an idea, their own idea of using the local place, the climate, also making local architecture from the local raw materials, among others, and also their understanding of the universe and maybe religious systems and literature and so on. And that's, I would call it the loss of human biodiversity, because architecture is made by humans, for humans. And this biodiversity, I think we should be more worried about as architects, and maybe our activity should be more about creating human biodiversity through our architecture rather than copying ideas from some other area or some other architect. And so just try to understand the local language of or dialect of architecture, and not copy the form of it, but the idea why they did that. Maybe it was because of climate, maybe it was because of some cultural issue, but just to understand that, not to copy it, but that would be important, I think. Here are some sketches or symbols of architecture from Sami reindeer herding people that I find, for instance, interesting. If I build in Arctic regions, would be interesting to understand why these forms and what they were doing with them, and then do my own version of understanding of thing, or contradicting it even if necessary, but at least studying it first. The top one, Njalla, which stores building so that animals can't eat the food that's been stored there. And we have used this typology at least once in a building I will show soon. And human beings, being living creatures, they have a necessity of positioning themselves in the best possible spot at all times, like every living creature, from bacteria to some animals living on the savanna. And but we are more advanced in the way that we can have a shelter or refuge that we can go inside. But at the same time, we want to have a control and overview of the outside, again, inside, outside. But biologically, this means that you are sheltered, but not blindfolded. You are in control. And these are things we call, for instance, sea view and landscape view from our houses. So they are not just values that make the house higher price, but they are biological needs. And yeah, maybe not talk too much about this, but there are kind of steps of how we imagine that architecture comes around by positioning yourself first into the landscape and making the shelter there, and starting to use the landscape as your harvesting grounds, and then call it home even. And then this could be extended into homestead or urbanity and becomes more and more landscape, like man-made landscape. And the sixth one is a kind of romantic idea of where the mechanized parts of your production, traffic and information become quite big parts of your living landscape. And is this a good thing is a question, but this is a very old discussion, so it's nothing new. I think people have always been worried about the latest development. But for sure, our houses reflect, or let's say, do merit our biological needs, for better and worse. And I'm just showing these two examples here on the left-hand side. I feel that the idea of sheltering and overview is not in balance, that you have no feeling of shelter there. You are exposed to much. So the overview is like more important than the sheltering function. And on the right-hand side, I think the positioning in the landscape and overview shelter is in a more interesting biological balance, that you can decide whether to expose yourself or whether to withdraw inside almost a cave-like structure. One more thing about ecology, with the relationship with man and nature, or culture and nature, is that we are the newest idea of sustainability sometimes in urban areas becomes the kind of museological way of protecting nature, where nature is seen something that you cannot touch or shouldn't touch so that it can survive, that we are the bad part of nature and destroying it. And of course, in some set it has coinage, but one thing we have to remember also is that in ecology, there's something called edge effect. And this means that if you have a kind of homogeneous ecological system, let's say forest and a meadow that are naturally occurring to that area, there's a certain amount of species richness in both. But in the meeting point of these two, there will always be a higher species richness than in those monotonous areas. This is very interesting because we are quite often creating these edges when we are doing things in nature, making an opening in the forest. And by doing this in a right way, we can make a new habitat that allows for greater biodiversity. So I think architecture also makes edge effects. And if we know this, we can kind of imagine that we are not only constructing, but if we learn to do this better in the given situation, we also are doing gardening. So that kind of architecture and gardening could be a bridge between the man and nature. And psychologically, I think what I said, the sixth point about positioning in the landscape and how the landscape might have become a collection of production and traffic and information more than this kind of sites, and how it could create a kind of non-continuum of places which have no greater meaning to us, so that we can kind of flow through our days without really having a meaningful place to stop at. It's a kind of dystopia. And I also think that our work is to create places of meaning and sites that are kind of anchored in time and place. And this has to do with our mental health more than our kind of connection to nature. So you see how I'm jumping now. And these are a good theatrical productions of places and sites of meaning. Even these very creative people are able to create them in their theatrical or filmological settings. Surely architects can do the same. Nature, at least for Finns are very often thought as forest, and so maybe it's more honest if I step into the word forest in this sense. And here we can see the remaining forests of Europe in different kind of intensity. I think the darker one is more intense forest. So we can see there's quite a lot of them still left. This is a forest I was walking in a couple of weeks ago while I was hunting. Just wanted to show how beautiful it can be. The word for Finnish for forest is metsä. Could be nice to hear what is in your language actually. You are neighbors to Finno-Ugric language groups, and the kind of basic word for forest was metsä, written as the first one. The second one is Finnish, Estonian, Karelian, and North Sami. And in Hungary it's mese, but it doesn't mean anymore forest, it means far. And this is interesting, so you kind of feel that in those areas where forests are not so many left, the meaning of the word has changed into something that is far away. I just found out this by accident, so it might not be true even, but it's kind of tantalizing idea. And these are people who are our four ancestors in the forest, the shamanistic people who lived and believed in forest. While in our Western culture, very often, in especially popular culture, the forest is the place where all the bad things and horrible things happen. It's a frightening place. So if you go to forest, you better expect something terrible to happen to you. This is very clear for me when I'm consuming the entertainment. I see always that our feeling, how we were still learned when we were kids, was that if you are frightened of something, you go hide in the forest because there you are safe and sound, because nobody knows where you are if you can stay silent there. But urban Western culture has changed the positions there, that the forest has become the part that is outside your safety area, which is kind of fenced away from the forest. This is very simplified version of seeing, but again, it's good to be aware of this tendency. So I'm moving on to the material that we have chosen to work with most, but not only. It is wood, and it's because it is the forest is producing this for free, and it becomes so many things. So we are creating workshops where we are trying to tell a story of something with wood and crafting it. And in best cases, this kind of activity becomes something you could call culture of wood, but it really means that all this cultivating, production and using would become a kind of chain that everybody knows, not only where the material comes from, but also how you use it and how you maintain it and take care of it. And this is happening in Vorarlberg, Austria, at least I have noticed. So we have one small project there on the right-hand side, made of local material by the local people, and we just saw that this is something we could emulate in many places in Europe. So I recommend a trip to Vorarlberg, Austria, to see the local, how the wood architecture is part of a chain of material production and understanding. It doesn't happen over a day, so I think this has taken 50 years to develop, at least by Hermann Kaufmann and architects like this. So it's an active goal setting that has been a success. So going back to the question how to choose material for the benefit of architecture, I think it's better to do it in a longer term plan. Let the materials become architecture in this way, that it is part of a culture in the area. So forest becomes many things and in many scales. So it's a kind of scaleless material to a certain point that can become many things. And we know there are many species of wood as well. And we can articulate the wood into several products that are more complex and have certain values we like with glue and heat treated. So yeah, nature and human, nature and man. So there are tendencies to call many ways of producing architecture, many imaginary stuff as something ecological. But I would call it, and so do many others, greenwashing of your your product. And while we have examples of traditional ways of building that were hugely more ecological, and again, I'm not saying that we should copy these things at all, but we should understand them and do our modern versions of this, because it is so that if we want to make things change into the direction we need to do something like this. It has to be pretty radical, and I think this is not radical. This is just continuation of the same trajectory we have taken already some time ago, and just decorating it with some green stuff. It's not understanding something, it's just imaginary, using images. And what we have been doing for the last 20-something years, this is an old slide, by the way, so we are running in 228 workshops now. We are doing small projects with students or young architects or just our own team, ranging from artworks to bridges to small houses, and testing things basically mostly with wood, but not only. So choosing material means in this sense that it is just part of the tool set, and if possible, not coming from so far away from the site either. What workshop does to our students and to ourselves is many things. And if you want to sum up, let's not read all this every word, but in short, I think the idea is that architects would already as a student, you would demystify the idea of constructing things, and that would help us to empower ourselves to become at least closer to some kind of master builder that we once were called with the name architect. And it's also a social happening, so I think it's teamwork more than some creative mastermind finding out something. So I believe very much in communication and teamwork, in creation as well. We are an animal species that is made to work together. And also this Confucius proverb is very good for when we talk about making things with your own hands out of the chosen materials. It is about not just hearing or seeing things, but just simply doing them and understanding them that way. I believe very much in this when talking about materials, for instance. And even when I have been teaching school kids as well, I carried some land art workshops with them, and I just realized how clever they are using the materials they found that exist in the forest and create fantastic stories out of them. It's always, I'm really happy after these workshops always. I'm kind of forget the creativity of human being and the teamwork ability a little bit when you work in your everyday architect work, but with kids you still have it fresh. So I think we should play more when we are working and not be so serious always, because this playfulness is creating fantastic site-specific stories. The rest of now I've been kind of sidetracking enough, so the rest is more like just slideshows of our materials. We have projects we have done ourselves on different locations, like this on an island here in front of border, like doing everything on the site and with students and friends. And there's some kind of robust design idea in the beginning that we create, and then we follow that and adjust on the site. But in this case, we organized the program. The client wanted to have it in one big cultural house, but now it's in several smaller units and sits better on the landscape and follows the traditional way of building. This was the Njala storage building that we wanted to use here as well, as a sign of Sami people once inhabiting this area as well. the main building. And some smaller sleeping units. All the material we brought on the islands, like in several other island projects we have done since, we always try to use all the cutaway pieces as well, so that there's no residue. So these cutaway small pieces of timber boards are actually cutaway pieces as well. So, and some details that are site specific. There's really hard winds, so you have to anchor all the buildings to the site. But here also the material is mostly wood, but we also use steel and on the wires and foundations to be sure that we maintain in 50 meters per second wind. Some images how it can be when it's really strong natural phenomena here. Another small workshop just in 10 days with students using one singular piece of board, repeating it into a space, a fireplace for local youngsters in one village in Norway. So a very simple shelter using one material bit. And a similar project in Estonia, your neighbor country, where we made a floating river sauna in Soma, Estonia. I believe it's still there. And this also being a site-specific interpretation of the ideas of a boat and a sauna coming together, swimming in the river. A dancing pavilion in Venice we made the previous Venice Biennale, not only based on the site we were given in Corte del Forte, which is an old castle, but also on the kind of cultural history of Venice, especially one film and book, The Death in Venice, that we were using as a reference as well. So the end result was a wooden structure that we again went to make with our team on the site out of timber and this time textiles as well, to create some a bit cooler microclimate. It can be really hot in Venice in the summer. At the same time, maybe having some associations to Asian culture. You couldn't help thinking that Venice was the other end of the Silk Route for a long time, and the spices and silk textiles were coming to Europe via Venice, where they were shipping them onwards. This was a historic site, so we couldn't make any foundations that go underground, so we were putting the building on some kind of skis this time, and also flat roofs with water drainage systems. But the main thing here again was that it again was one of the workshops, and this time we worked together with the activist group called Rebiennale from Venice, who are not only using the material from biennales afterwards to create socially and culturally meaningful projects like immigration shelters, but also acting against negative phenomena to Venice, like the big cruise ships. So they are the guys who are trying to stop the cruise ships coming there. So we were doing this project together, and it was the first time Rebiennale also was actively using so much wood, so it was a learning process both ways. Below is our team. Just to mention, the political aspect of this was also obvious. It became in the opening. You see the curators of the Biennale from Ireland behind there, and then you see the mayor of Venice opening our project, and we had a dispute with the mayor, me and him, because we had people of different color in our work team, and he asked them to go away because they were selling drugs in our workyard. He thought So I had to defend them and say that they are our workers, so please don't harass them, and so on. So I think the idea of inclusion instead of exclusion is important in architecture, and we would be always defending inclusion of all kinds of cultures and people in our architecture. It's hard to understand what is the benefit of choosing your clientele so strictly like this man is doing. Sorry for the political comment, but can't help saying it. Another project was based on very humble small structures that people are making on the islands here in North Norway for either some certain kind of duck bird that they collect the feathers of after they have laid eggs and flown away. People used to go in these small shelters and collect the feathers that the birds were using for laying the eggs onto. So this structure, plus a structure for drying fish, became our kind of goal setting for a cultural, scene called Salt, that is a traveling nomadic structure at the moment in Oslo, housing culinary happenings and concerts and lectures and a sauna inside, plus some small structures that we also made for overnight accommodation. So we had artworks inside these structures and sauna, like I said. And this is now in the harbor of Oslo at the moment. So it's also using wooden structures as the main thing, but then supporting it with steel wires and textiles. Still trying to kind of remain nomadic in the sense that you can practice together in a pretty short time and move it into another location. And some just general images of our projects to make realize that we don't always use woods. There is metal and concrete and steel also when that is necessary, like the bridge on the right-hand side bottom corner is in a very humid and windy area, so wood is only good for the surfaces of the bridge, not the structures. And also left side bottom, the pavilion of Norway in Dubai we have designed. The first idea was to make it out of wood, but the wood was deemed to be changed into aluminium because of reasons of climate and sponsorship this time. So sometimes you have to, your ideas are not competitive with the client's ideas, and this happens. But we are recreating the Dubai pavilion in North Norway as a school building afterwards, and then we can do it out of wood. So the story becomes quite nice in the end. We are currently negotiating about this project. And sometimes we also, like the last workshop in August, we were in Greenland and made a public fireplace to one small Inuit village. We used just found timber and stones from the site, so it's just totally local material. Of course, timber is not local to Greenland, but this is reused timber, so it kind of feels that we haven't at least brought it on the island. So this is 15 tons of stone that we piled in a form to make this shelter against the very hard winds on this spot. And at the moment, I'm guiding a workshop that is a floating bathing system to Trondheim in the middle of Norway. It's not done yet, but we are kind of combining different kind of materials on floating platforms to create saunas and banyas and onsen, Japanese bath, and so on into a kind of complex bathing small village. Again, the materials, how to choose them. We have to, the left bottom corner is plastic floaters that are produced by a local producer here in North Norway. That is the material that can handle all like ocean conditions. So we have to choose that material there, but then otherwise we can mostly use wood in our system. These things I mentioned in my really sidetracking lecture, however, have very good books that one could read about these themes. So I'm naming some here that I would recommend reading. But I think this might be enough now. So I hope you are still awake and and thanks for listening.
Thank you, thank you. Oh, it was so inspiring. I just wanted to listen.
Yeah, if you have any questions, anyone, so I could try to answer.
Yes. Okay. Actually, I don't know. Maybe I should start with questions that our participants put on the form, starting from, I don't know, maybe convenient daily questions like when talking about materials in contemporary architecture, how important is carbon footprint of construction materials?
Oh, you are asking me this.
Do you think we need to consider this issue as well?
Yeah, of course, yeah. So I think it's a big question. So how to answer that in a kind of short manner is to say that of course it is important, but I think part of our problem is that when we tend to try to solve some problem, we create a system, and that system becomes sometimes more important than the problem itself. So I'm feeling that yes, we should be worried about the carbon footprint, but when we start calculating it, sometimes we already make mistakes, because I think the more obvious and more innovative and kind of inspirational solutions could be much more simpler than just basing on the carbon footprint Excel arc. So I'm just saying almost that what you see on the site should already give some answers and your kind of idea where you are. But yes, of course, we have to, the more complex the buildings become, the more we need to be relying on calculations that are then the measure. But there's an interesting statement from some mathematicians I heard recently, that they have proposed that our societies are becoming so complex that there's no mathematical way of presenting them, and that so much energy is used in this complexity instead of what it was firstly created to, that they were asking all professionals of every field to try to simplify their part of this complexity rather than complicate it. And this is where we are at, I think, is that we should at least try to simplify architecture for the sake of not using energy for the complexity of our societies. And I think there is much more to do than in materials. It's about creating a system that is less complex.
I wonder, what is your opinion concerning using timber in construction more widely, like for multi-story housings?
Yeah, I think we should test all different ways of building, even if it is kind of against some of the, let's say, rules of the game today. So I think this is what we try to do in the workshops, that we are doing small things and sometimes don't ask anyone. It's just do them to see what happens. But of course, in bigger scale, this is not so possible. Although I had one slide that I took away of a Russian guy that built a 150-meter high wooden building by himself in over time in Siberia. I'm sure you will find that picture in the internet if you try. It was of course illegal, this building, but it's just an example that of course it can be done. It's just about other parameters around these things. I think we are often ruling out certain possibilities just because they are against a set of rules which per se are not so important than ecology at the moment. And ecology and wood are of course go hand in hand. So I would say that there should be certain kind of changes in rules that they would allow more prototyping of things.
Yeah, but still I wonder what would happen when extremely popular become this material, and what's happening to our forests. By the way, in Lithuania it is miškas.
Miškas.
Miškas, miškas. Yeah.
Okay. So maybe it is somehow relatable to the metsä.
Yeah,
metsä,
yeah, it's in a way, yes, it is.
Nice. But yeah, what to say? I mean, all our materials come from nature. Some of them are more articulated than others, and I think we should head for the less articulated ones that need less energy to be refined. So mining is much more worrisome process than deforestation, because forest you can plant again, and mines you can't plant stones. So, or for instance, like this. So just to be very simplistic again.
I see. Okay, so more questions. What are the most common mistakes when combining building materials? What materials are incompatible with each other? If
I wouldn't state that I have so much knowledge about these things at all. So it's I think we should all think this together. But for sure, like in cooking, I think it's a good reference always. I think new ways of cooking come always when you join two materials that don't belong together. So I think it's the same in architecture, that we should test these things before we know something. So I don't know is my answer. But of course, there are some classic things that already been tested and go very well together, like iron and concrete. Reinforcing concrete, and so these are very lucky things. But there are some architects who have a very beautiful way of pairing materials, like Carlos Carpa, I think, in his very refined projects, like joining concrete with some more noble material makes both of the materials more interesting, like contrasting them. So.
I see. Okay. Thank you. One more question, very interesting. Marius Ivaškevičius maybe can more explain, but what he kept in mind. Materials on their own affect a person differently. Some have calming effect, others causes emotional tension. Is it possible to create a form that is calming from a material that in itself causes tension? I'm not sure. Mario, maybe you may explain what you mean by material that in itself causes tension. Give us an example.
I was referring to the article about how I think it was done in Japan, how they presented people to the steel or concrete wall, and some of those persons who mostly didn't like it, and there was recorded tension. There was an experiment with humans, like they were connected to some machine that could recognize tension, and then they recorded tension when the wall was presented to the people. So yeah, so I was referring to that experiment, but it is more wider question that there are, I think, more materials that causes tension, but yeah, it's interesting if it's possible to make calming form with those materials.
Thank you.
Yeah, again, I think I'm still learning these things very, very basically. So I think, of course, yeah, I think there's many great calming pieces of architecture made of rather harsh materials, and that's also like even enhancing its beauty sometimes. I would imagine Sean Consel's architecture in Australia as one example of using corten steel in creating really, at least in pictures, really calming places. I haven't visited them, but just talk with him about this. But I think more my problem again with this complexity idea being that the complexity of society and so on, being that I think if you can reduce the amount of materials in your building without making it function less, would be already interesting and more calming. I feel that most of our creations have so many components and catalog materials and things that we don't know where they come from. That's the kind of frightening part of buildings today, or the kind of that doesn't make you calm, is this the amount of products we sample into a building, and they all kind of are composite materials and so on, so you don't even know their history or where they are made and so on. So I would say rather that than just the quality of the material itself, but the amount of them. I think somebody estimated at some point that 100 years ago there was 5 different materials in a building. I don't say that was a good time. It's often very poor and unhappy times, but at the moment when it's 50,000 different composite in the same size of building, then it's the balance maybe somewhere there in between anyhow.
Thank you. Augustas Lapinskas is writing, thank you for the lecture. Could you please share any links to the floating sauna project you have shown at the end of the lecture?
Yeah, I think soon. It should be opening in December, so I will post it in our Facebook page at that moment. It's called ARC system, ARC, like many other things too, but this is the kind of product we have created, really, that you can link together into a floating village that consists of office, like home work offices as one unit, and a cottage and bathing structures and so on. So it's a commercial thing we are selling to different cities here in coastal cities here in Norway for cultural happenings. But yeah, it's a locally produced all the components, and one component is the floating objects, the elements made in Tromsø in North Norway, and then the rest is wood and of course glass. So, but trying to keep it pretty simple and always in the same form as well. So, kind of minimal repetition project.
Oh, great. I would like to ask you, I was very intrigued by your concept of edge effect in architecture. Could you elaborate more? Like, do you keep in mind different groups of society meeting together at that point, or it could be also add some value to biodiversity?
Yeah, there's some examples of this in human history, very good examples of how certain people have inhabited an area which as a starting point is quite poor in soil and possibilities, but they have made it flourish. And even in pretty surprising places like in Amazonas, where most of the nourishment is in the trees and the vegetation all the time, not so much on the ground, so you can't really do anything there. But they found out that the most biodiversity hotspots in Amazonas even are usually human-made. So even in the kind of what we consider as the pristine nature, it seems that the nature does better when the humans who knew how to garden the nature were helping it pretty much. And also you can see it in the Nordic countries that we have this something we call cultural landscapes, where there was small scale farming happening, and there was a richness of species which is disappearing at the moment because we are not farming anymore, and the forest is growing all over the place. Of course, some species come back like bear and wolf, but they also disappear a lot of species because they can't live anymore in the forest. So if you have both, you have like a much better situation because yeah, that could be one example. And then of course, even within the house itself, we can do many buffering ideas of using the solar heat passively and different materials using their insulation or therm storing capacities much better. We are already doing this kind of edge effects as well. And also even the form of building itself, how it can create the microclimate is very important, especially here in the Arctic. So we always try to create a form that creates a southern western courtyard where you can actually be when it's windy and just a little bit sunny. And in that courtyard you can farm apples even here in Bodø, even though it shouldn't be possible, but we have apples and plums here next to our houses, and everybody knows this as a part of tradition even, that this is what you do with the free space that you create between the buildings. You create microclimate and that creates diversity.
Before the lecture, you have mentioned your method of work, that you are usually visiting place and living for a while in order to get know better it. Is it, how do you manage? Okay, I can imagine that it works in Western culture, but for example, if you are designing some objects in South Korea or Japan, that cultures are totally different, I would say, or not totally, but in a way quite in many aspects different. How it's possible to get into this culture and context?
Yeah, of course. You might say it's an interesting discussion always, this one, because it's kind of course, easier to relate to where you come from. I don't actually know where I come from because I'm from South Finland. I live in North Norway and I work a bit all over the place, so I don't have any home ground like that. And I also feel that there's no two sides that are similar. So in a way, if you take this to extreme, you shouldn't build anywhere else than where you live, or like that precise spot where you have your house, or I don't know. So it's kind of really a limiting idea. I would imagine the opposite is true, that every time you design, you are in a new situation, no matter the culture or the nature or anything. You should take it as a kind of white slate as a starting point, and then start like trying to understand what is this. So there is no two similar spots, and then it's less important if it's in Japan or North Norway, because then it's more about the local set of culture and biological facts and so on. And to know these, of course, you can do a good job or a bad job. So that's up to the people themselves. It's about anyhow discussing with people and finding information from them. So it's like a base work. But I have like in the project in Korea, I was working 1 month on the site with the workers together, and also in Japan I was 1 week when they were casting the concrete to follow up that one. And so it's been fun always to be present as much as possible on the construction sites, even if you are not constructing yourself.
Thank you. Juste Pečulytė writes, thank you for such an inspiring lecture. You mentioned new ways of cooking and the fact of allowing the prototyping. Do you think there is a need to reconsider the pre-project stages for architects and clients as well? Maybe also to rethink the time and the frameworks for research and development?
Yeah, it's a complex question. I think we often don't have time to kind of develop several itineraries for our ideas. So we are kind of strained in our timetables to go pretty quickly to a solution. And I think university should be a place where this testing takes place as well. So I think everybody who is also teaching on the side of or next to the having a practice, I think know this, that it should be more possible there at least at times. So these workshops are more than half of them I've been doing are educational workshops for some university, and I feel that there's still a good possibility to test things, of course in a kind of limited scale and of time and materials, but still. But to make really test projects otherwise, I think it's very much about the whole way of constructing, how we are doing, how it's relating to all these components and how they have to be used to fulfill the regulations. So it's a kind of very difficult ball game in that sense that we are pretty tied. But still, I'm sure there are some collages of things that could be tested in a different manner. And you see always, if you have some remarkable utopian oriented people, like some youngsters we are having here in North Norway, 100 kilometers away from here, that have built their own mud houses under glass cupolas, and it's just making really brave attempts to create different other kind of architecture. It can be done if you really believe in it. So even the local regulation then will bow in front of it and allow it to happen. So I think it's just about the will in the end and the communication between people, which takes time.
It is. Thank you. More questions? You are also welcome, just put in words, not write down. Yeah. So, yeah, maybe there is no questions anymore. So thank you so much, Sami, for your really forceful lecture. I just keep thinking and realizing Linas Tuleikis is writing, thank you very much. The presentation and its extension were really interesting. See you next time, maybe. See you next time, yes. They're hoping you to meet in Lithuania alive.
Yeah, that's right. Awesome, yeah. Thanks for inviting for this kind of middle of November warm-up. It's I haven't had so many lectures lately because of the traveling bans and everything, so it's nice to kind of keep connected and discuss things. And I'm sorry I didn't answer your question directly. I had to kind of dodge it by making other questions. And
yeah, but I think it's very grabbing. It's a kind of like creating an atmosphere with an architecture, like micro.
It's an honest try to show where we are at the moment with our working, that we know these answers exist and they should be answered, and just trying to find the methods that answers them instead of trying to answer them like from your table, sitting, and so we try to kind of create the form that could answer it. And I think that's the question about the form and material, is that the form is important.
Yeah, your diagram is splendid. You should use it more widely.
Yeah.
Albinas Giriūnas is also writing, thank you. So maybe I'm finishing our lecture with a new, presenting the last one in our cycle. It's our well-known architect, Audrius Ambrasas. We'll talk about material and details, how it's important to keep attention to the last thing, the smallest thing, like a detail. So I'm switching to Lithuanian. Taigi, ačiū visiems dalyvavusiems ir pristatau mūsų paskutinę ciklo paskaitą. Tai yra architektas, nacionalinės kultūros ir meno premijos laureatas, VGTU docentas Audrius Ambrasas kalbės apie architektūrinės detalės ir medžiagas. Ir pasak jo, labai svarbu architektūroje yra meistrystė. Ir meistrystė ne tik tai statytojo, bet taip pat ir architekto meistrystė. Ir būtent ji labiausiai atsiskleidžia per detalės, tiek jas kuriant, tiek įgyvendinant. Anot Cuntaro, Audriaus Ambraso mylimo architekto, detalės išreiškia tai, ko pagrindinė idėja reikalauja konkrečiam objekto taške, priklausimo ir atsiskyrimo, įtampos lengvumo, trinties, kietumo, trapumo. Žodžiu, per detalės iš tiesų galima labai daug pasakyti ir tai nėra tik puošmena. Ši paskaita vyks gruodžio 8 dieną, tai prašom rezervuotis laiką. Kaip visada primenu, kad šį ciklą mes organizuojam kartu su partneriu žurnalu Statyba ir architektūra ir jų portalu sa.lt, finansuoja Lietuvos kultūros taryba.